Hi, Gareth Hosking here, and welcome to Shopper Marketing Experts. Today I'm excited to introduce our latest webcast series highlighting 5 keys to thriving in a disruptive retail environment. We have broken these 5 keys into a 4-part video series, all of which you can get at Shopper Marketing Experts, where we also have full end-to-end shopper-focused, bite-sized learning content for you to stay at the competitive edge in all your marketing efforts. As always, I have with me one of our resident experts, Toby Desforges, and a special guest from the US, who we were fortunate enough to catch up with while he was in the UK, and that is Patrick Fitzmaurice from Caterpillar Farm Inc. So, without further ado, here is Toby with Patrick discussing the 5 keys to thriving in a disruptive retail environment. They kick off in video 1 with understanding your target shopper in depth.
So, hey, it's nice to see you here, Patrick.
It's a pleasure to be here in London with you. I'm delighted.
We're going to spend a bit of time talking about disruptive retail and what it is we can do about it. And I think before we do jump in, I think it's fair to share with the audience that we're of a sufficient age now to recognize the second phase of major retail disruption,
Absolutely.
Not just the first. Because I guess when we first started our career many moons ago, the thing that we would talk about was the consolidation of retail. The importance of a one-stop shop, which is now kind of, as a format, 60 years old, which folks is actually older than both of us, I will say.
Indeed.
So we grew up in that age where people were beginning to move from small retail environments into large consolidated retail environments. We grew up in a time when people like Walmart, people like Carrefour, people like Tesco were beginning to pull together to build this massive consolidated retail structure. And the big dynamic, I guess, when we first started work was, how do we deal with these new major multinational key accounts? But, in the last 7 to 10 years, that's no longer the major dilemma that people are questioning. Is it small stores or big stores? Today, we have a retail environment that looks nothing like it did even 5 years ago. And I guess probably, it's easy for people to see the obvious changes, the generation of e-commerce as a real part of life, the use of mobile versus just desktop. But actually, what's happening in retail, I think, is much more nuanced, much more explosive, much more interesting than just that talk alone. Do you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's funny, having looked, if you look at the cycle in retail, which are long cycles, because retail is an industry that doesn't actually change on a dime, right?
Totally.
It's operationally driven. There's tons of logistics and supply chain to it. It's a real estate play. So retail as an industry does not pivot on a dime.
Absolutely.
Having trained in the U.S. the past couple of years, a lot of people, and I'm a bit of a history buff, I take it back 100 years ago in the U.S. 100 years ago in 1917, so a little more than 100 years ago, was the opening of a big retail revolution in the U.S. And that was when Piggly Wiggly,
aptly
named, the Piggly Wiggly chain was the first major chain to say, we're not going to have you come in and hand your shopping list to a merchant who will be behind the desk and pick things off of shelves in the back room and hand you your sack to go home. We're going to put product out and the shopper will actually take it off of shelves. Think about it. Nobody actually thought at the time that was a massive retail innovation, but it actually drove a lot of things after that. We're in the middle of one of those times. Nobody quite understands the structural implications of what gets thrown around too easily, omni-channel experience, et cetera, whatever that means to people. But the notion that the shopper actually has complete power over when to buy and where to buy and how much to buy and the decisions in the buying process, it's way more than a retailer having availability. Now we have to think about engaging a shopper chooser as they go through a path to purchase to get things for their life. And that structurally is disruptive to retail, which is a really operationally driven model.
Yeah, look, I mean, I totally agree. And I think, first things first, I can't help but smile at the name Piggly Wiggly.
Piggly Wiggly.
It's
a US thing.
I'm totally, is it still going in the US?
Indeed it is.
Awesome.
Largely Southeast region.
We are so going to go and visit that.
Come on down.
We're going to be over in the US.
We will go to the pig, which is what the locals
We're going to check out the pig. and I'm looking forward to hitting pigglywiggly.com.
Exactly.
It's just
exactly.
It's awesome. But, coming back to the point, we've got a situation where real retail, which by the way is not dying, right? It's not dying. There are, I guess, by any fair estimate, well over 100 million retail outlets in the world. It is arguably the biggest single employer globally. We still all go to shops every single day. So this is not dying because it's changing. But you're right, it does take time to change. And yet at the same time, anybody can open a retail environment. You and I could spend a couple of $100 and a few kind of happy hours, and within a day or so, we could have a shop on the internet. And that is equally feasible, and it could look just as good as pigglywiggly.com.
Exactly right.
So we have this dichotomy of very, very fast moving change and then quite slow moving incumbents. And we equally have an interesting situation where the people servicing that environment have also got to address a big change in the way that they systemically think about themselves. Because if we go back to probably not 1917, but only a couple of decades afterwards, we start to think about how it was that Procter & Gamble started to grow as a business and so on. This whole concept of understanding the consumer, the end user of the product, and building a fantastic distribution path. That was what made consumer goods businesses. Today, we are in the age of the shopper. And the shopper doesn't feature in that model, right? It's not in there. So we have a situation where not only is retail rapidly changing, but also the person who's making the decision about value creation is a person who's not actually considering a lot of business models. And as a result, as retail gets disrupted and this business model gets disrupted, there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of, I think, perturbation as to how things are going to move and change.
I would just to kind of crystallize that, and I'm a pretty simple guy, so I like to boil things down to simplicity. Your P&G example is a great one, right? So as much as 1917 was the birth of Piggly Wiggly and the first quote unquote shopper grocery store, when we were building our curriculum, we actually looked and said, when did classical CPG brand marketing take hold? One of my editors actually traced it back to 1932 to a gentleman named Neil McElroy. In the bowels of P&G, wrote a manifesto about organizing around brand units. It was kind of the birth of classical trained brand management. And it had nothing to do with shopper. It had everything to do with making my brand relevant in people's lives. Fast forward to Walmart as an example of a retailer, right? Walmart grew in its scale in the US, not as being a great shopping experience, but being a wickedly good operational merchant.
Totally.
So now we have these two worlds colliding in the age of a shopper is the last thing, right? Legacy marketing, legacy operational retail. Now we're in a world where the shopper person is the one that maintains so much control in the interaction with a brand and a retailer, and they've not overtly been inserted into the model and the equation.
Totally agree. And we could argue for hours as to whether this change has been promoted by a change in the way that we behave as human beings, or whether it's been promoted or provoked by a change in the way that retail has behaved. It doesn't really matter. The reality is that those two core realities that drive the way that manufacturers go to market and the way that retailers work, they have changed, and they're not changing back.
Exactly. They are not going to revert. But I want to piggyback on something you said a minute ago. Retail is not dying.
No.
Right. It's fascinating to me that sometimes people think that. I had the pleasure of emceeing a big global conference in Las Vegas back in September. And the theme of the conference was how to compete in an Amazon-driven world. Right. So there's this reactionary thing that says retail will go away because of some beast like Amazon or the likes of an Amazon. Retail is not going away, right? But the way people want to shop and interact with retail will change. And how do you adapt business models and process and build people skills in order to be able to win and capture growth in that world?
Exactly. So we are in a disrupted retail world. Whether it is a disruptive world or whether it is disrupted, it is open for debate. But at the end of the day, we're here.
Yes,
we're here, and there really are a lot of people out in the community saying, well, what do we do? So this webcast is all about looking at some of the things that you can do, some of the things that primarily we think at Shopper Marketing Experts, but I want to use those as themes.
Love it.
For me, the first thing to do in the age of a shopper in this disrupted retail environment is to get to grips with who it is that you're targeting. And when I start talking about understanding the target shopper, I've got to tell you that there are a lot of marketeers in the community whose hackles start to go up because they're like, well, what about the consumer? And I guess there are probably a lot of sales guys who go, well, what about the customer? Now, when I say understand the target shopper, I am not excluding consumers or retailers. And by the way, guys, I'm not asking you to create a completely different view of the world where one persona is different to another. What I want you to recognize when I'm talking about understanding the target shopper is that whatever happens, there is an individual who makes the decision to purchase a product. And that is not the person who writes down the shopping list. It's the person who picks the product up, puts it in their cart, and pays for it, whether that's online or offline, right? That person has a set of behaviors which are different to the behaviors of using a product. And it's that person whose behavior we need to influence, I believe, in order to drive growth in the long term in consumption. Because if I don't put the right bottle of shampoo in the shower, whatever happens to the person who's in the shower is not going to use it. Now, if it's a male like me, I'll use anything. I am feeling like I smell like mango this morning.
And you look lovely.
I do, but I admit it. I had mango shampoo this morning on my hair because I've run out of shampoo and I've used my kids. But hey, that's a shopper process that we're talking about. So understanding the target shopper, I think, is increasingly important.
Totally agree.
When it comes to understanding the target shopper, how, when you're talking to your clients, how do you get people to cast that out?
Yeah, so as you talk to companies about this, first you have to get them to a belief stage, right? Any change management is people need to believe there's a reason to change. And so the first thing to get them to believe is thinking about a shopper strategically is actually important, and it will be of benefit to them, and it will help them capture growth. So you need to get them to kind of believe that along the way. Then what I find works is nobody argues that in the consumer marketing world, making my brand relevant in people's lives, that I actually don't market to everybody. I actually think about who are my target consumers. When I write a brief for media work or when I anchor my brand positioning statement, I declare who I'm talking to and why I'm relevant to them and why I have a reason to believe that they should have affinity for me. Nobody argues about that in the consumer marketing world. If you believe you have to treat shoppers the same way, then we have to have that conversation. Am I marketing to every shopper? Probably not. Who do I choose to market to? Where might that shopper choose to shop more often than others? How might I start anchoring in that type of strategic thought before I go about the act of creating activations to go capture and influence them? And so a good parallel I found is to say to people, we don't argue about this in the consumer marketing world. It's established behaviors that we know we need to do. If we're really going to elevate thinking about unlocking growth through shopper-centric thinking and planning and strategies, we're going to have to think more strategically about that person. And that becomes a way to kind of transition people from the old way of thinking to applying the same concepts to this new way of being more shopper-centric.
I totally agree with you. And I think if you can internally as a team, if you can get over the idea that the shopper is strategically important in the same way as the consumer is strategically important, in the same way as your retail partner is strategically important. If you can get over that, then actually I think the process for identifying a target shopper actually is amazingly simple, because you'll know, as you say, all your briefs have a list of characteristics of target consumers. So, they will say, female between the age of 12 and 17, engaged in modern media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you say, right, okay, I can see this girl that we're targeting for my mango shampoo. In fact, this was a boy, but never mind. Yeah. So I can see that person. The next question is, so who's going to buy this product? Is it good? The girl might go out and buy her shampoo, right?
Right.
She might. But more probably, there'll be somebody else in her family. And more probably, unfortunately, it's still going to be female.
Right.
Yeah. So, we can start to say, well, actually, you know what? Our target shopper is clearly the mother of children like this. Right. And I think it's a fairly easy process to get to grips with.
Yeah. I think it was so I kind of mentioned history earlier, right? I think it was an identified moment in history that when A.G. Lafley of P&G said, I think it was 2002, that P&G stood for the first moment of truth, right? And that was at the shelf where whoever that shopper was deciding to put this in their buggy versus this in their buggy, and what else was going in there. And looking back on that, you say, here is the world's largest advertiser, the company that gets credit for developing the best senior level marketing talent. And they're actually saying it's not about the strength of their brand promise in people's lives. It's about making a connection at the moment of conversion where somebody chooses. That's a pretty compelling thing that I actually think, I don't want to say it's skirted under the radar, but people start throwing out first moment of truth and second moment of truth and then ZMOT kind of stuff. They just kind of throw it out as terms. But here was the world's biggest global advertiser with the strongest and the most billion-dollar brands saying, yeah, my brands matter, but what happens at that moment when they choose to pick me over somebody else is where I have to win.
Absolutely.
That's a shopper thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because without that, it's not going to drive consumption.